Hello everyone and welcome to the Cult of Paint channel. If you are new here, if you're not new here, welcome back. My name is Andy and today I want to talk about how I painted this bust in a day. So we're going to call it a speed paint, and I'm aware that speed painting can come under many definitions. To me, this is definitely a speed paint because normally I would spend hours and hours on painting a bust. I haven't painted loads of busts in the past, but when I have, I've really enjoyed it and I've spent a long time on it, maybe up to 2 months or something. So painting a bust in a day was definitely a challenge. This video isn't a tutorial as such. It's really just about how I did it and why I did it, and I just thought it would be a fun video and take you through it. But there should be some cool ideas for colours because I'll tell you all the colours I used and some mistakes I made, and yeah, hopefully it's just a fun little video for you guys to watch. So why did I want to speed paint this model? Well, it's part of the Cult of Paint Kickstarter, Deogard. Hopefully you've all seen that, hopefully some of you have backed it, and basically one of these stretch goals was unlocking an academic version of this bust, the Woodsman. The full version has these huge horns, sword, and it's just amazing. And we have a few box arts of those done already, but we didn't have anyone who'd painted this academic bust. So Henry said to me, "We really need a box art for this bust." And I was like, yeah, we do. But how are we going to do that? So our friend Keith at Versatile Terrain, really cool of him, he printed out a bust really fast and a really good quality print so I could get it painted fast. And I received it on the final week of the Kickstarter, so I knew I had to do a good job. We also unlocked 2 tutorials, and one is going to be a how to paint busts for beginners, which is going to be on this bust again. And then the other one is going to be a full masterclass on the full version with the horns. So I knew I was going to paint 2 versions in some time in the future, so this definitely should be a fast one, and I could just have some fun with it. So if you've backed the Kickstarter and you want to paint this bust, there will be a separate beginner lesson on this bust, which I'm really looking forward to, and we're going to use just the brush for that, no airbrush, to make sure it's accessible for everyone. And then I'll do the second version. I'll probably go all out and try and do my best on that. So when it came to doing this one, I was like, okay, how can I do this fast? And there's a few things that you can obviously do to make a paint job faster. The first thing was, I thought, well, if I don't do human skin, if I do an ethereal kind of colour, like a bluish colour that you see in Games Workshop's Sylvaneth, it won't take me as long because I won't need to be as accurate with things like tone and making it look realistic. So that will definitely speed things up. The other thing I'll do is not do a super refined, so I won't worry too much about blending it. I'll just try and get some cool light and shadows and just be a bit sketchy, and that's a style I actually really like. Sometimes it's fun to do things that aren't super refined and perfect because it does take a while. So I basically had this idea of using the artwork from the Sylvaneth, and I have a Sylvaneth army. I'm a big Sylvaneth fan, so it was easy for me to have a go at that. I really wanted to. I've painted some Sylvaneth in this colour before, and what I really liked in the artwork was the kind of OSL glow effect, where it had the warmer, more yellow-green coming up from the other side. So I thought, right, that's my colour scheme for sure. I'm going to do a bluish, kind of greyish colour for the skin, and I'm going to have a secondary light source which has this green OSL. So I started out with a nice big brush, a size 5 from Artist Opus, and I started painting in these kind of bluish, greyish colours, and it was looking reasonably cool. So you'll see here I have a still of where I ended up, and I just felt it's kind of too blue. So then I had a second attempt where I played around and got some greens on there. I used the airbrush to try and just get some colour and find the right tone. And eventually I was like, okay, this is kind of what I wanted. I've got the colour right, but now I've actually built up a lot of paint. And even though this is a speed paint, I still want it to look okay. And I made too many mistakes at the start, or not mistakes, but I didn't get what I wanted. I was too blue, too greyish. So I thought, even though this is a speed paint, I want to start again because I feel like I've messed around and I've learnt the colours I want to do. I've found the recipe now. So I'll start fresh and nice thin paint. And I've got to try and get it right now, because if you're on your third attempt, then you've kind of ruined the idea of a speed paint already, right? You've spent a lot of time. But anyway, I stripped the model and I started again. So I started off with a zenithal prime. So I've got Tamiya white in the airbrush, and I knew I wanted my light source from the left. So I thought I would just get a nice zenithal prime on there. And the pear was going to be a very pale colour, so I knew I wanted to work from an almost white base coat on that. I generally like working with skin areas from a more pale base coat. So yeah, I definitely wanted to start out with this. On the first version, I just went in with the brush purely, and this is how I would prefer to paint a bust, because I don't mind how long it takes and I will get a better result that way. But I thought, hey, this is a speed paint. It's got to be done today. So I would rely on the airbrush a bit more. So yeah, it's going to be quite an airbrush heavy model, but I think that's cool. So I made this kind of greyish green colour. There's some really nice colours such as Sybarite Green from Citadel, but I feel they're a little bit saturated. So what I did was just add a drop of grey, and that would desaturate the colour and work a bit better at this scale. I think when it's a little gaming model, it's cool to do super bright colours, but as it's a bit larger, I wanted to slightly rein back the colour. So I started applying this quite pale colour over my zenithal highlight, and I just kind of gradually darkened it up. So I built up a few more layers, and it got darker and darker as I built up the opacity on there. Eventually I built up an okay mid-tone, but I wanted to put in some stronger shadows. So I turned the model at a steep angle and started spraying the shadows on. And this was just adding a bit more grey. The grey I'm using is Petroleum Grey, and that has a little bit of purple in, so it's a very nice contrast to my greenish skin. I'm painting the shadows after the highlights. And I generally find if you're going to use the airbrush, that's the better way round to do it. And it's just to do with how much you cover while you're spraying. So you can see the model now. It's got some shadows on, some highlights. We're getting a good foundation. I decided it wasn't opaque enough, so I started to just build up a stronger green. And this is just the Sybarite Green and grey mix again, but just maybe a slightly different ratio and maybe a little thicker. It was probably a little translucent before, so I didn't get any colour across at all, really. After I got to almost a pure grey, I thought I'd airbrush some, a base coat for the OSL, so I did a warmer green. And I think this was my first major mistake, and you'll see what I did later, but I think I would have preferred to basically painted all the model and finished with the OSL. It's good to plan OSL normally, but because I'm using the airbrush to do it, then it would have been fine to do it at the end, and then it would cover all those details. So after I finished airbrushing, this is what I ended up with. And I took a bunch of still photos for this, so we're going to do the next few steps just with photos, but I think it's actually quite clear for you to see what I'm doing. And that's why I said at the beginning, this isn't a tutorial as such. It's more just me taking you through my kind of paint process and a few mistakes I did. And also because I was trying to paint this fast, videoing really does slow you down. So just grabbing a still between each step did allow me to get this bust done in a day and make Henry happy. That was the whole purpose. He really wanted to see a painted version of this. So yeah, you can see my foundation. I've got this nice soft shadow, and I like the desaturated green tone. I think this was actually a really good foundation to start with because it's not got too much airbrushing on. It's just a beginning. But what confused me or made it difficult was that little bit of OSL. I'd rather have that had just been pure shadow so I can get this early stage and stuff right. So moving on to the first step, and here I just really roughly brushed on a slightly lighter colour. So this was Sybarite Green with a little bit of grey in to desaturate, a tiny bit of Caribbean Blue from Scale to make it a touch bluer. I was always trying to find that balance and get the right tone. And the colours I owned were either too blue or too green, so I was always kind of fighting, trying to find that right mix and also keep it desaturated too. It was easy if I just used some pure colours like Sybarite Green straight out the pot, but it was just a little bit too vibrant. So I layered this up with a nice big brush, and you can see lots of brush strokes where I was moving up and down and just trying to paint most of the model, actually, a really large soft highlight to build up the next foundation. And there's always a difficulty in painting normal paint over something you've airbrushed, mostly to do with the finish. It's so matte when you airbrush normally, and when you hand paint something it's normally more satin, and there's always this strange look and strange interaction, so that's why I try not to do it too often. But all I needed to do was just do quite a few layers, and eventually it did look good. But the first layer of paint over airbrush paint looked pretty awful, to be honest. It looked quite mottled, and it was basically where the paint was translucent and you could see the super matte paint underneath. But anyway, I moved on. So basically I added a little more Caribbean Blue, and I think it was a little more Gauss Blaster. I was permanently mixing up the highlight colours, to be honest. I was messing around on the palette, using some ivory sometimes too. This point in reflection, I didn't paint these highlights big enough, so I basically ran out of room. So I wish at this stage I'd done a much broader highlight, because it's so easy to repaint in those shadows. But if the highlights get too narrow, it just looks too wrong. And because it's skin, we want quite soft, big highlights rather than making it look shiny like metal. But I did like the tone. It was that nice ethereal blue, and it was still not super saturated. It's bright and it's pretty out there for some skin, but it's not over the top. Hopefully you agree. So looking pretty minty now, and the highlights have a little bit more of the Gauss Blaster green, and I ended up changing this, which you'll see in the next step, but looking back it was actually kind of cool and kind of nice, just probably the wrong volume, but I think I just needed to blend that kind of shoulder highlight, and like I said before on the previous photo, that previous step I didn't do it broad enough, and that's why this shoulder highlight doesn't look quite right. So I decided to redo the previous step and make it a little bluer and cover a larger area. And there you can see that's what I did. So it's very blue now, but I think I was probably heading towards a too greeny mint colour, and I knew later on I was going to be doing that green OSL, so I needed to keep it slightly more towards blue, but not as blue as my first attempt. You can see how my brain works here, where I'm making mistakes and just trying to get that colour I like. I'm sure we've all been there before, where you have a colour in your head and you just can't quite get it. And I was kind of trying to do this at pace, so it was tricky. I had the physical piece of art on my desk while I was doing it, so I was kind of checking and making sure I was getting the right vibe. But yeah, this was okay. I knew it was a little saturated, but if I covered over it with some brighter, less saturated highlights, it would work. So in the artwork, the highlights were almost white, so I tried that myself. I took my previous mixes with the Caribbean Blue, a bit of Sybarite, and I added some ivory, and I didn't use pure ivory. It was still had a little bit of blue in it. But what I found was when I took a photo, it did really appear as bleached out white. So I think it was not a mistake, but I'd have preferred a slightly darker highlight. It's just a little bit too pale. And it was fine in the end result, but yeah, this was something I wasn't super happy with. Yeah, in the hand, it didn't appear white. It looked quite nice actually, but this is a photo for the internet to try and advertise our Kickstarter at the end of the day, so I wanted it to look good in photo, and unfortunately it did appear a little too white, and I tried editing it a bit to try and make the colour match real life, but it just didn't play ball, unfortunately. Still, not deterred, I thought, yeah, I've got a better foundation now, so I decided I need to get some much darker shadows. So after all that hand painting, I returned to the airbrush, and I made up a greyish shadow colour with all the paints I'd used, and I diluted this really heavily, sort of 5:1, and that meant I could blend the colours together a bit as well as get some darker shadows. So this is probably what we would call airbrush glazing, because it's pretty diluted and you can gradually soften stuff this way. It's actually a pretty cool way of doing stuff. So I start to push the shadows a lot more, and I'm using that grey, and I eventually use pure grey, the petroleum grey, and before I always had that mix with the little bit of green in, so it never appeared that dark, and then I did the OSL, so I actually never had any really dark shadows, so I basically used the airbrush to glaze this grey in, blend the colours a bit, and actually get that contrast I needed, and that was really important on his right hand side, our left hand side, by the serratus here and the pec, to get some contrast. And once I had those shadows in, I was actually pretty happy, especially on his side that wasn't going to receive the OSL. This is what I wish I did with the original airbrushing sketchy stage at the start. Just did all the shadows, and then I would have worked out the main colour and not do the OSL at the beginning. So here you can see the bust has all the highlights on, and maybe they're a little white, but they still look okay. And we have a nice dark shadow to work the OSL in, and we have also a really nice shadow, and that shoulder worked out really nice in the end with the volumes. So nice soft mid-tone, and then just that bright light right at the end. I think that's cool. So switching back to the still photos, this is what it looked like after the airbrush smoothing, and you can see that grey shadow makes a real difference, and the little hint of purple is a lovely contrast. It's a little blue, but you'll see later I think actually that worked with the green. But yeah, I was reasonably happy. The thing I was most annoyed about was I went a little bright with my highlight. I should have stopped a few stages before, but I still think it looks kind of cool, and in the artwork they did go that bright, so yeah, I think it works. Basically, I wanted to paint all the details because I knew I was going to airbrush on the OSL, and obviously the details need to have some OSL on too. You can't have just the skin and not the rest. I painted these really fast, so I think I did all of the details in under 40 minutes, and I know that because I was watching a TV show at the time and I didn't manage to get through an episode. So I just did the leaf, a green with 2 highlights really quick, and the jewels I did with some blues, the Caribbean blue again because that was on the palette, and then the shade for those was a Watercolour green from Citadel, which is a really nice super dark jade. And then I just used ivory and embossed a quick highlight on. And then the brown was just some burnt umber. And the eyes I did quite simply too, but that made a real difference, just getting those eyes in there. And luckily that was kind of it. I just did a couple washes on the straps. So yeah, really not much at all on the details, but I think it's fine for this purpose. So now back to the airbrush, and I start with a very thin dark green, which is my favourite olive green, mixed with this awesome colour from Monument, which is bright yellow green. That's really nice, that paint. And they work together really well too. So this was quite thin and it worked really nicely over the shadows, as you can see. Then I just started adding more of that bright yellow green, and airbrushing OSL is okay, but it gets to a point where you can't paint it fine enough. And I mean, no one can paint it fine enough. I would much prefer to paint the OSL by hand, which I'll do in the masterclass, but this was great for this quick kind of approach. And you can see I'm just focusing on all those areas on his left facing downwards. So I finish and go back to the brush and I use the bright yellow green on its own. So I just sprayed that colour, but when you paint stuff with the brush, it's way more intense because the pigment is coming out denser rather than being diluted in the airbrush. So I just exaggerated and I kept turning the model back and checking it was the right angle and that it looked good from basically the photography point. And then I would go back and build up the layers. And this looked fine. It looks really great on the chin there, as you can see. And after I painted on that brushed on green, that was it. And this is the finished result. So I hope you think it's cool. It took me, I think, about 7 hours, 6.5, something like that. Which, like I said, is really fast for me. And it's not perfect, and there's loads of mistakes, and there's tons of stuff that could be way better. So I guess when I just put the model down, I was a bit like, ugh, this is not great. But after a day of putting it down, I was like, do you know what? That was cool. You did a bust in a day, which you've never done before, really, apart from an orc, but that's a bit different. And it looks cool. Looking back at the artwork, it's similar in terms of colours. And do you know what? You've managed to get a box art done in time for your Kickstarter. So I think it's cool, and it was a real good learning process. I definitely learnt a lot about, getting the volumes right on busts, even though I've done it before. And it was actually quite challenging with the different colour. I guess I'm actually used to painting human skin. So getting that blue right was a little bit of a fight. And I'm really glad that I'm going to be painting 2 more versions of this bust, because one thing I did learn from painting this was, it's fantastic. The face is epic, and I really liked highlighting it. It was a shame to just highlight it up really quickly, but I've got 2 more versions to do, so I'm looking forward to taking my time with those. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Like I said at the start, it wasn't really a tutorial, but I just wanted to show you what I learned and what I messed around with, and you can see all the mistakes I made. But hopefully it encourages you to maybe try busts, and maybe it doesn't seem so scary after this. That's my hope anyway. I'm really looking forward to doing the beginner lesson for people who've never painted a bust before. Because Cult of Paint is all about trying to make people try new stuff and not be afraid of painting. And from when I've spoken to people, they're quite worried to try other scales. Maybe if they've only painted Games Workshop, that it's quite scary to paint a huge figure like this bust. So our whole aim with this campaign and the Kickstarter is to make figures that are approachable to paint, even though they're a larger scale. So it's really exciting for me to do these tutorials that can support and hopefully help you guys. But if you did back the Kickstarter, then hopefully this makes you excited to paint yours. I'd seen all the box arts and Miniacs video painting this, so I did this after seeing all that, so I was really excited to paint this model. And if you haven't backed the Kickstarter, there is the last couple days left at the time of posting this video, and you should be able to late pledge if you're watching this sometime in the future. If you want to see more in-depth tutorials where I explain these kind of techniques but properly, as always, please check out our Patreon. And I'd really like to see comments from you guys about this video, if you enjoyed it, if you thought it was a waste of time, or if you thought it was cool to do this different style and see what I could do in a short amount of time, because we do want to do a bigger variety of videos rather than just the straight up tutorials. So it's always great to hear from you guys. Until then, have fun painting and looking forward to the next one. See you later.